Hi, everybody. My name is Edith Bayer. Welcome to our webinar on the Oregon Energy Strategy, giving an overview and an update. We see a lot of people still joining, so we're just going to wait another minute and then we'll get started. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janine Benner. I'm the director of the Oregon Department of Energy, for those who I haven't met. Thank you so much for attending this webinar about the Oregon Energy Strategy. I'm going to just say a few words to open us up and then kick it over to my colleague Edith. But basically, the Oregon Department of Energy has been tasked by the Oregon legislature to develop a statewide energy strategy that identifies pathways to achieve Oregon's energy and climate goals and to maintain affordable, reliable energy. And this strategy is aligned with our agency's mission to advance solutions to shape an equitable, clean energy transition while protecting the environment and public health and responsibly balancing energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. That's the mission statement that you can see here on this slide. With so many Oregonians experiencing rising energy costs, often driven by needing to make our energy infrastructure more resilient to things like increasing climate-driven disasters, wildfires, ice storms, and deadly heat waves, the timing of this energy strategy could not be more critical. It's exciting to be here today to begin talking about some of the details of how this energy strategy work will progress, and also how all of you can help inform the strategy. So now I'd like to hand it over to our Clean Energy Team Leader and Energy Strategy Project Lead, Edith Bayer.
Thanks, Janine. Hi, everybody. I'm Edith Bayer. It's really great to be here. And I just wanted to talk about a couple of housekeeping items before we start. First, I just wanted to remind everybody that this meeting will be recorded. And the presentation will be available on the website for the energy strategy shortly after that. We'd like to ask you to enter your name and affiliation in the Q&A, if you don't mind, so we can keep track of everybody who's here today. And I also want to explain that we'll be doing some live polling during this webinar. We'll be using an app called Slido, which you should see on the right side of your screen. It could be kind of on the right or at the bottom. It's a green S. When we get to a polling question, which we'll do soon, you'll see it pop up there. And that's where you'll answer it. And if you don't see it, you may just need to refresh the app. Just click on it and don't forget to click submit so that we can see the answer to your question. So I also wanted to pass the mic over for a moment to my colleague, Jessica Reichers, who is the manager for the policy and innovation team here at ODO, who's going to be managing the questions and answers, and we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to run that as well. Jessica, on to you.
Thanks, Edith. I appreciate it. Jessica Rickers, as Edith mentioned, I manage the policy team, and I'm already seeing some people filling out the Q&A with their name and affiliation. Thank you very much for doing that. I will also be monitoring that same Q&A for questions throughout the webinar. If you don't know how to find your Q&A, if you look at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a circle with a question mark inside of a rectangle. If you click on that, your Q&A will pop up. You can even tell that pop up to split out into a completely separate window if that's helpful to you. There are going to be two types of questions I'll be monitoring for. One is clarifying questions that maybe something that Edith described you didn't quite understand, or it needs a little bit more context. Those I'll try and break in and ask those questions as they come up. The others I will be keeping an eye on, and when we get to some natural breaks in Edith's presentation, then I will be reflecting those back to her. So, also if you throw a question for me to me in the Q&A about anything in particular, I'll be happy to answer that. Also, we may have some people responding just through the Q&A if it's a really highly specific question, but in general, we'll be throwing most of these over to Edith for her to answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. So here's the agenda for our conversation today. We're going to start with an overview of Oregon's energy landscape and a description of what the energy strategy is and why we need one in the first place. We'll then talk about how we're approaching the technical analysis. And finally, we'd like to provide some details on ways that folks can get involved in the process. And we'll leave about 30 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which I think Jessica already mentioned. So again, please type in questions as we go. We'll be tracking these questions, and we're looking forward to hearing from you towards the end when we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to start with a couple of polling questions. So this is the first test of whether you can find Slido on your screen. So the first question is, did you attend the Energy Strategy launch webinar in November 2023? Yes, no, or maybe you weren't aware of that meeting, in which case there's a recording on our website you could check out. And I'm going to give a minute for answers to come in. My Slido just popped up, so maybe that was the timing for you too. And this is turning out to be a really useful question because I can see that a number of people did not connect to that webinar, and that's totally fine. And we're going to give a lot of the background that we gave there today just to bring everybody on the same page. And then we'll go further and start to talk in a bit more detail about how we're going about getting started with the work. So thanks for answering that question. So the next question is, what are you most interested in learning today? So we're talking about a few things. What is the energy strategy? How will the energy modeling inform the energy strategy and policy recommendations? And what are the opportunities to contribute to developing the energy strategy? You might think all of the above, but we're looking for whether there's kind of a primary purpose for you today and what you'd like to learn. And I'm just going to give a little bit more time for folks to answer this question because this is really helpful for us to see. I should add that the full answer to the question of what is the energy strategy will be answered by November 1st of next year. But today we'll talk about what the idea is for developing it. All right. I'm just going to give it another minute so that people have a chance to respond. And so while you're responding, I'm just going to move on, but Abby, maybe keep it open for a little bit so we can catch any replies that are still coming in, if that's okay. Okay, so thanks for that. And I really want to start kind of by stepping back for a moment to look at the big and complicated picture that is our energy system. So this is a Sankey diagram from our biennial energy report. This will be updated November of this year, in fact. And it's kind of a noodly flowchart that shows you where our energy comes from and breaks it down by what's producing that energy and how we use it. And there are a few points that I want to make here. First, we produce some of the energy that we use in state, but most of it is actually imported. And that's part of the picture that we need to keep in mind when we talk about developing an energy strategy. So on the far left of this slide, you can see energy produced. So that's energy that we produce in Oregon. You can see imported electricity, and then you can see other energy that's not electricity, like natural gas and petroleum that's imported from outside of the state. And then you can see that here we use kind of generic energy on the far left, and then the next set of bars talks about what kind of energy that is. So energy is produced by hydropower, wind. Further down, you can see biomass, coal, natural gas, petroleum. And then if you go even further to the right, you can see that a lot of that is converted into electricity. And then finally, you can see kind of the breakdown of how that energy is used. It's used in homes, it's used in businesses, in industries, and in transportation. And so I think that you know, two takeaways from this complicated slide. I don't expect anybody who hasn't seen this before to absorb it fully. But first, we use energy from a lot of different sources for a lot of different purposes. That's our starting point for our energy strategy. And secondly, some of that energy is produced in Oregon, and a lot of it is also imported. And this is the landscape that we're starting with. So in this slide, it's a little easier to see where our energy comes from. So you can see in this pie chart that petroleum, natural gas, and hydro are the three biggest sources that we have. We also use quite a bit of coal, quite a bit of biomass, wind, and there are other resources in there too. And on the right, you can see where's that energy going? About 29% of it goes to transportation, cars and trucks, and other transportation. About a quarter of it goes to homes. A little more than a quarter powers industrial processes, and about 19% goes to businesses. So this is kind of where we use energy if we think of our whole state split up into these four sectors. So here's another view, but now I'd like to zoom just into the electricity sector. So electricity isn't all the energy, as you remember from the first slide, but it's a really big part of the energy that we use. And you can see here that hydropower accounts for the biggest share of Oregon's electricity production. There's also a big share of wind, of coal, and natural gas. And coal and natural gas are the resources that are most responsible for our electric sector carbon emissions. And if we fast forward to 2040 and the 100% clean electricity standard in HB 2021, those are the sectors where we need to look at clean alternatives to decarbonize the power sector. So then if we look a little bit deeper across different sectors, different end use sectors, if we look at the transportation sector, which as you saw accounted for about 29% of our energy consumption, gasoline and diesel account for the biggest sources of energy powering our vehicles. They're also the biggest sources of emissions. And so if we go out to 2050, these are the places where we'll be looking to alternative clean sources, including, you can see here, electricity and also low carbon fuels. And we're watching the Climate Protection Program rulemaking right now and keeping in mind the important role that that program will play in driving emissions reductions here. Then if we look at buildings, here we've split up buildings into homes, residential energy use, and commercial energy use or businesses. And if we look at buildings, you can see that the lion's share of our energy use is in the form of electricity. That's the kind of light blue, 47%, 53% in this chart. That's followed by natural gas and then biomass. And again, there's a challenge to decarbonize these sectors. So that brings me to, why do we need an energy strategy? Oregon has ambitious energy and climate goals. They cover electricity, transportation, and direct use fuels. Direct use fuels include things like fuels for industrial processes or for heating your home. And there are a lot of things going on at the same time. We are also seeing changing weather patterns affecting the energy system, wildfires, a need for increased focus on resilience. All of these things are part of the picture that we need to consider when we think about the future of our energy sector. In our 2022 Biennial Energy Report, we asked ourselves how Oregon might meet these goals, and we looked at what other states had done. we reviewed 20 technical studies from around the country, and we concluded that the state would benefit from a state energy strategy and by undertaking the kinds of analysis that we've seen elsewhere. An energy strategy can help align policy development, regulation, investment, and technical assistance. It can help identify pathways to meet the state's policy goals while considering different technologies, different approaches, and trade-offs. It can help maintain affordability and reliability. It can consider ways to strengthen the economy, to be proactive rather than reactive in how our energy sector evolves. We can prioritize equity and work to maximize benefits and minimize harms. So last summer, House Bill 3630 directed ODO to develop an energy strategy that identifies pathways to achieve our energy policy objectives and that is informed by stakeholder perspectives and by existing resource plans, energy-related studies, and analysis. The bill calls on ODO to develop pathways. It's not just one route, but rather to consider trade-offs. And that includes things like costs, efficiencies, feasibility, and the availability of different energy resources and technologies, economic and employment impacts, energy burden, affordability, environmental justice, and community impacts and benefits. We'll also be looking at land use and natural resource impacts and considerations, and things like energy resilience, security, and market implications. So it's a pretty tall order. The energy strategy, oh yeah, Jessica, go ahead. I think you might.
Hi, Edith. I have a really great question from the Q&A, and that's from Beth, who's asking, in the energy flow slides, she wants to know what's waste energy, since we had 772 BTUs lost in that.
Yes. Waste energy is energy that's lost and that doesn't actually help heat your home or power your vehicle. There are a lot of losses. Another word we can use is inefficiencies in how we use energy. And so this is one of the reasons that energy efficiency is so important. So losses happen everywhere from the power plant itself. Losses can just be heat that goes out into the air rather than turning the turbine. There are losses that happen on transmission wires and distribution wires. And then there are losses actually at the device level. So cars are a really good way to look at that. Like fuel economy standards try to reduce the losses in the car itself and make it more efficient. It's a good question.
And I just take this opportunity, since we stopped, to remind folks, if you joined as a participant and haven't added your name and affiliation to the Q&A, we don't have a chat on this webinar, but if you could do that, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. So the energy strategy ultimately will take the form of a final report with 3 parts. And this again comes from the bill. There'll be a summary of the energy strategy and pathways to achieve Oregon's policy objectives. There'll be a description of stakeholder engagement and how stakeholder perspectives informed the energy strategy and recommendations of policy options. The starting point for this work is going to be number 1. It's really undertaking the technical analysis to understand where we are today and what the different pathways or options might be and what the trade-offs are for those different options moving forward. And so that's what I'd like to talk about next. I'll start by saying that we have just kicked off work with our technical consultants, the Clean Energy Transitions Institute, who we chose through a competitive procurement process, and we're very excited to be working with them. They really know their stuff, and you'll hear more from them in the future, although today you're stuck with me. But they helped us prepare these slides, and we have been speaking with them quite a bit on how we structure the analysis, which will help us also structure in the engagement, which I'll talk about in a moment. So it's useful to start with the tools that we'll be applying. We're going to be undertaking a modeling exercise. So the model will take a look at the whole energy sector across the economy today. So not just electricity, not just transportation, but across the whole energy sector. And it will make assumptions about how energy use and how that how energy needs are met into the future. Importantly, the modeling is going to be structured to meet Oregon's energy policy objectives, including Executive Order 2004, which calls for an at least 80% reduction in economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. HB 2021, which I've already mentioned, the 100% clean electricity standard, the Clean Fuels Program, and Climate Protection Program, just to name some of the really big ones, but there are other policies in there that we'll be looking at. So the model is designed to meet those objectives, and within that, to look at least cost solutions, or look for least cost solutions. And by making different assumptions about the future, we can evaluate the trade-offs of different pathways and answer what if types of questions. For example, what if more or less transmission is available? We can put that question into numbers in the model and into rules in how the model works, and we'll see what the effects are on the rest of the energy system and on what needs to be built and on costs and on other effects. The model cannot answer all questions though, so we'll also be conducting some complementary analysis and applying results of the modeling to get insights into other areas like jobs, like public health, and like land use. We will also be looking to evaluate equity effects. So I think it's important to talk about the goal of the technical analysis because it's easy to get kind of lost in the idea of looking at the whole energy system and kind of projecting into the future. So all of this serves to inform decision making. It is not a prediction of the future. It's also not a place to debate settled policy. We're going to put in where we are today, the policies that we have. It's not going to answer all questions or model every future pathway. There's just a limit on how much we can do. So what we're doing is investigating choices to help evaluate the pros and cons of different strategies, to try to ask strategic questions, and to help identify strategies that can help manage or mitigate uncertainty. There are a lot of uncertainties right now facing the energy sector. And we will be looking out to 2050, which is the time horizon of Executive Order 2004. And that will really serve to inform near-term actions needed to meet our decarbonization goals and to identify gaps and opportunities. So the technical analysis is structured to help answer questions that can inform policy direction. And these questions can be driven by policy choices. We might want to test what a certain policy can accomplish, or they can anticipate potential risks or opportunities. So here are a few examples of the types of questions that we might ask, but they're not the questions we're going to ask. I want to emphasize here that this is one of the things that we would like to define through engagement with you, and why we'll talk quite a bit about engagement in a little bit. We want to work with you to identify the strategic questions that we should be asking in the energy strategy. So here are just a few examples. What if developing new clean energy resources is delayed? What if consumer adoption of technologies like heat pumps and electric vehicles occurs more slowly than expected? What if transmission expansion to access resources outside of Oregon is harder than expected? Or what if hydrogen pipelines and other clean fuel delivery systems cannot be constructed between Oregon and other states by the time that we anticipate they might be constructed? So how are these scenarios developed? I'm going to dive into a little bit of the how. I started with the what, this is a bit of the how. First, we start with a model of Oregon's economy. This is similar to what you saw in some of the earlier diagrams. So we start with dividing up the state by residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors and the energy demand in those sectors today, and then make assumptions about what that demand might be over time. That helps then, if we go to the middle box, identify Oregon's energy needs. So the needs are kind of responsive to the demands on the system. So how much electricity do we need to meet the requirements of all these sectors? How much do we need in transportation fuels? How much do we need in direct use fuels? And finally, the model helps us understand how we can meet these energy needs most efficiently, maintaining reliability, meeting our policy objectives, and considering cost. So just to give an example, we might define how much electricity we need, but then the next step is to understand how we generate that electricity and how we get it to homes and businesses. Okay, diving a little bit deeper into the guts here. So what goes into a scenario? Again, the scenarios are kind of the places where we test out these strategic questions. So each scenario tries to help answer a question or series of questions, and we do that by changing something in the model. That can be done by doing more or less of something. So here you have an example of heat pump adoption. We might see more or less adoption of heat pumps, and that will have an effect on how we decarbonize heating, whether with electric heat pumps or with something else, and what our needs are to meet our decarbonization objectives and heating demand. We can also learn by completely turning something on or off. For example, the model can allow new transmission to be built, or it cannot, to reflect barriers to transmission development. And that can help reveal the role of transmission and what happens if it is or is not available. And of course, you can also have levers on more or less transmission as well. So these are just illustrations of the tools that we have. So again, these are not necessarily examples of what we will test. We will be looking to the engagement process to help us decide that. And the scenarios will help us test uncertainties and see the impacts of policies, of actions, of customer behavior, like in the case of heat pump adoption, on energy needs, and on how energy is supplied. So to deepen your feel on how the model is structured, sorry, I'm actually going to go up one over here. So we're here in the left-hand box. So we're looking at the first step, right? So we have our residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation demands. And then we're going to look at the demand kind of by appliance. So in the residential sector, we'll look at air conditioning, space heating, water heating, and we'll look at how much we have today, what the energy demand is, and make assumptions about how much energy we'll need in the future and how many of these appliances will be in place and what their characteristics will be. And we'll do the same for end uses in the commercial sector, in the industrial sector, and in transportation. And in total, there are about 70 subsectors, and by subsectors, I mean these bullet points here that the model will look at and define. So it's pretty detailed stuff. So now I'm going from the micro to the macro level. So Oregon, as you saw, operates as part of a larger energy system. And so it's important when we're looking at the Oregon energy strategy to understand the other kind of forces that impact costs in Oregon, resource availability, and things like that. So here are a few points of how we're going to approach that. The model will include competition for fuels, including biomass, renewables, and hydrogen derived from renewables. And that's to reflect that there's not an infinite amount of these resources. There's some competition out there, and that is something that's important to take into account. We also are aware that Oregon is part of an interconnected electricity system over a pretty large and diverse region. So we're going to take that interconnectedness into account and also capture transmission line and pipeline flow and build constraints, not just in Oregon, but in the region. And it's also important and really interesting to think about how the variety of resources across this whole region, the variety of different kinds of demands and time zones can actually contribute to helping us meet our goals because of kind of complementary resources. The sun may not be shining here, it might be shining elsewhere. Same with where the wind is blowing. And the bigger the system, the more resources we have to draw on. There will be areas that don't plug into the model directly. We can't quantify everything, but these things are an important part of the analysis. And so here are some key areas where we will be conducting additional analysis, often building on what we learned from the modeling, but then applying it. And so these are just a few examples. We'll be looking at the energy wallet of representative customer groups to examine the full energy costs. You could think of it as the energy budget of a household and how those costs shift between petroleum, electricity, and gas, because ultimately the energy strategy is looking at the trade-off with different pathways, and those pathways kind of change the balance maybe within the energy wallet. For example, if you buy an electric car, your gas bill for that car goes to zero, but you're paying more for electricity. So we want to make sure to reflect that. So the energy wallet helps us see that picture. We'll also be looking at health impacts related to the effects on air quality of decarbonization measures using a model called COBRA from the US Environmental Protection Agency. And that might be the effect of reduced diesel and gasoline powered vehicles on the road and reduced tailpipe emissions resulting from that, or reduced biomass combustion for heat. So we want to make sure we can reflect some of those benefits. We'll also look at different parts of the state to identify differences in impacts across the state. And that can also be applied to look at some of and think about some of the land use considerations that we may not be able to fit in the full economy-wide model, but we might want to look at more closely. So we'll also be using some of that kind of differentiation around the state to look at effects of different pathways at community level. We'll look at effects on employment and on the economy. So the starting point for the technical analysis is really looking at existing models and plans. So we're going to ground the analysis in recent utility integrated resource plans, clean energy plans, CPP compliance plans. We'll also be reviewing Oregon energy policies and document how the modeling accounts for them. So I've already mentioned a number of those policies. We also will be reviewing from a regional perspective. So it's important to take into account the Northwest Power Plan and also to follow key developments as the Northwest Power and Conservation Council develops the next plan and works on what will go into that. We'll also look at the PNUC, the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee's 2023 Northwest Regional Forecast. All right, I think there's a more, okay, yeah. And we'll also be looking at a kind of regional program design elements, so things like the Western Resource Adequacy Program, the different energy markets that are under development or already operational in the region, and we'll be looking at regional transmission planning efforts, including the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition, WESTEC. So I'm going to pause there because that kind of wraps up the part of the presentation on the modeling and the technical analysis. As I mentioned, we're in a really early stage of this. And so this is really to give you kind of a shape of how we envision the modeling will look, how we'll be working with SETI to evaluate different pathways. And I'd like to pause to see if there are any questions on everything that's been presented up to now.
Hi, Edith. I do have a question from Bill. He's interested in how local community opposition to renewables or new transmission systems might be figured into the analysis.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a difficult question to answer right now at the beginning of this work. But I'll say that this is one of the reasons that we are working on an energy strategy, because we want to hear, we want to hear from you how you view some of these challenges and some of the issues that are coming up in that opposition, and to understand how this analysis could speak to that And there may be places where there are limits on how much we can do in the technical modeling, but I'll just remind everyone that there'll be a policy discussion next year. And I think some of these things will more easily be addressed when we talk about policy gaps and policy opportunities. And we're also following, I should mention, the Solar Rules Advisory Committee right now, who are doing some important work on this point. So we're very much paying attention to that too.
And I don't have any more questions, but I will just flag for folks again. If you do have a question, please add it to the Q&A. I'm keeping a close eye on it and can relay them to Edith as we go along. And Bill, thank you for your answer, by the way, Edith. And if you don't know how to see your Q&A, look at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And there's a circle with a question mark inside a box there. And if you click on that, your Q&A should pop up. And other than that, I don't see anything else having come in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Jessica.
Mhm.
If you think of questions that you didn't ask now, there's still a chance at the end, so it's not too late. All right, so now I'd like to turn to engagement opportunities, since this is, I don't know, I'm thinking of this as the fun part. This is where we all get to like roll up our sleeves and talk about what Oregon's kind of needs and opportunities and what sorts of solutions we can work on together. So as with the technical work, I'm really happy to say that we are getting ready to bring on board a facilitator who has, like with our technical consultants, the Clean Energy Transitions Institute, Kearns and West were chosen through a competitive procurement process. And we're thrilled to be working with them. We're just bringing them on board, as I said. So I'd like to caveat everything I'm going to say today by we still have to work out the details. And so I really encourage people, and you might hear this a few times today, to sign up if you're not already signed up for email updates, to check our website, because now that we are bringing Kearns and West on board, we anticipate things moving pretty quickly and having more information for you shortly. Oops, sorry, I meant to speak to this slide. Okay. So first of all, we have three kind of structures in mind, three groups in mind for the energy strategy. And for anybody who was there for the November webinar, this remains unchanged. So we have an interagency steering group that's already been formed that serves to ensure state agency coordination. And this group includes us, it includes the Department of Land Conservation and Development, the Department of Transportation, the Public Utility Commission, Department of Environmental Quality, Business Oregon, and the Governor's Office, and other agencies who are also invited to share their expertise, especially now that we are going to get moving with things. And this group meets about once a month. We also have an advisory group that we have not yet formed and that we envision serving as a sounding board for the energy strategy process. And so the idea for the advisory group is that it would be composed of people with diverse perspectives from across Oregon. So we would have all of those perspectives in one room, meeting once a month to both get an update on the energy strategy, but to talk through difficult questions, ask us questions, and help guide and inform the process. And then we also have planned to pull together working groups, and the working groups will serve to really get in the weeds. So these are people interested in discussing technical and modeling aspects of the energy strategy. And when I say technical, it doesn't just mean looking at there are all sorts of technical expertise. And for example, we want to make sure that when we're talking about transmission and distribution systems, and we're talking about fuel supply, that there's an opportunity also for people who bring a community perspective to also engage in those conversations. And this these groups are, we anticipate 7 to 8 working groups. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. And they will be meeting through July and August roughly to inform the technical analysis. So we envision more than one meeting per working group. Oh, Jessica, I knew there'd be questions right off the bat here.
Well, these are they're not exactly related to what you just went over, but I thought this was a good opportunity to jump in. And the first one, actually, I will answer. I'll give Edith a chance to take a breath and sip of water. I did get a question from Ron Fees about how in depth the employment impacts will be, and will they disaggregate impacts based on occupation, classification, wages, demand or displacement, needed training, etc. So Ramfis, we understand that there's a lot to the energy jobs component of all of this. And right now we're looking into options to sort of add to what's within the scope of this existing energy strategy. We don't have like anything to share right at the moment, but I do think that there's definitely some need to dive a little bit deeper into some of the questions around that might not be able to be addressed within the budget and timeframe of this particular analysis. And the second question is from Peter. Peter asked if distributed generation at the residential level, including solar and batteries, or other renewable local distributed generation strategies would be considered in the model to achieve resilience and climate goals. And I think that's precisely the kind of thing that we're hoping to hear from people in the coming months as we're out engaging. What things are you interested in the model trying to address? What energy questions do you have? So I'll hand it back over to Edith to see if there's anything she wants to add. But in general, these kinds of questions are exactly the kind of information that we're looking for at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And to that question on distributed resources, I'll just add that we will be looking at, we'll be kind of evaluating all resources, including distributed resources in the analysis. And then when you mentioned resilience impact, that speaks to the kind of thing that we, as Jessica said, really want to hear about, which is how we can start thinking about the co-benefits of certain measures. And if there is a resiliency benefit, how do we consider that in the model? So I think it's a really good question and something that we are excited to dig into. So we also plan to consult with tribes because this is government to government engagement. It's on a separate slide here, and it's on a separate track with each of the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. This obviously doesn't mean to preclude tribal council or members from participating in any other meetings. That would be fantastic. But we also plan to undertake this formal government to government engagement and to engage with tribal communities and organizations where appropriate, whenever appropriate. So we also have in mind these 3 kinds of meetings in addition to the groups that I mentioned above, which are more established structures. So there's a difference here. The groups that I mentioned before, the interagency steering group, the working groups, the advisory group, they require a bigger time commitment, and they have kind of an ongoing series of meetings. And so what we want to present here are one-time meetings, most likely, that are meant to enable us to hear from a really broad range of Oregonians on their priorities, their questions and thoughts about the energy strategy. So the first type of meeting that we have in mind are listening sessions. And as you can see, we've tried to boil down the first bullet to like, what purpose does this session serve? And here it's tell us what you think. So we plan to take listening session, that title, seriously, be in listening mode, schedule a few meetings so everyone can find a time that works for them, and really sit back and listen and try to understand where folks are coming from. And that will be really important to us in thinking about how we shape the energy strategy. We also realize that we may need additional meetings with additional groups on specific topics. Listening sessions alone might not be enough. And so what we mean by organizational meetings here is really extra meetings to deepen our understanding. but not to the level of detail of the working group. So this isn't like getting into the weeds on the modeling, getting into the weeds on data sources and assumptions, but it is getting to the heart of priorities, of concerns. So for example, we see the need for a meeting with environmental justice and equity organizations, and a listening session is probably not enough to really dig into some of the priorities and concerns and key questions for EJ and equity organizations. So we would organize an organizational meeting to have that discussion. And the details of this are something that we'll develop with Kearns and West over the coming weeks. And then you all are joining a webinar today, and we anticipate holding more webinars, probably 1 to 2 more this year. And they serve really to get updates or to provide updates on the energy strategy and to get a sense of what's coming next. So I'm going to try to summarize all of what I just said on one slide, and we'll see how it goes. So how will these groups work, and what's the difference? So here's another go at that. So I'm just going to focus here on the timeline for this year and the timeline to inform the modeling and the technical analysis. There will be work happening next year, but I just want to focus on the near term here to help keep things really clear. So in July and August, we anticipate holding, as I said, several public listening sessions to hear from folks. We also plan to organize some organizational meetings to deepen our understanding in some cases. And we will also plan to get the working groups started, and the working groups will, by topic, be getting really into the weeds on data sources, on making sure that we are using the most appropriate and Oregon-specific data. They'll be talking about assumptions and really getting into the modeling. And then ODO staff are going to be working throughout this process together with our consultants to synthesize the feedback that we're hearing. We will work to post information on our website and to organize it in a way that towards the end of August helps us share with the working groups what we've heard and help and we're going to ask the working groups to help us translate questions into numbers. That's the simplest way I can explain it. So you can imagine there being some priorities that come out of the public listening sessions, the organizational meetings, and then the question will be, well, what can we do in the model about this? Or if not the model, what can we do in some technical analysis? And so the working groups are going to help us kind of make that link. And so the idea is that the working groups at the start will be meeting to work through the data and the assumptions, and then they'll circle back around and consider this feedback that we've received. And throughout this process, the interagency steering group and the advisory group will meet approximately once a month to inform the process. And I failed in my animation, so there's another box that I think will come up at the end, but I just wanted to signal that we also see the engagement with the tribes as an ongoing process throughout this process here. I think that, yeah, Jessica.
Hey, Edith, I responded in the Q&A, but I thought it was worthwhile to sort of let everybody know the answer. Again, another question from Ramfis, who is asking about whether there would be an opportunity to engage labor as an affinity group to have a deeper understanding of implications from each of the scenarios in the strategy. And the answer is yes. We're hoping that many of you out there and others would help us to be able to find engagement opportunities with people and organizations that we may not have a direct relationship with. So just to share with the whole group that that's a part of our engagement effort, is to identify areas where people can help us engage with those who might really be interested.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And this is a perfect time to bring that up. Yeah, absolutely. And then the last thing I want to mention on this slide is just that once we've kind of worked through this kind of July through August series of meetings and conversations, we plan to pull everything together so that all of the stakeholder engagement will inform how we plan to undertake the modeling, what the scenarios are expected to be, and we'll have a webinar to explain how all of the stakeholder engagement, all of the conversations that we've had has informed the technical analysis. And so that'll be another opportunity just to reflect back what we heard and what we were able to do with what we heard and what we learned. So I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about the advisory and the working groups, because these are two structures that are going to be very important for the energy strategy, and that I think it's useful to just give a little bit more of a flavor so folks who are interested can start thinking about whether they might want to express interest in joining these groups. So the role of the advisory group, I called it a sounding board on an earlier slide. So it's really that. It's to provide insights, it's to suggest recommendations, to ask questions, to advise us, and sometimes to have difficult conversations that are important to have in one room and meet once a month over the whole project. Members of the advisory group will be asked to engage with their networks as well to help bring robust views to those meetings. The idea of who the advisory group would be comprised of, we anticipate a diverse representation of communities, of socioeconomic backgrounds, geographic areas, perspectives, expertise, lived experiences, and subject matter expertise. And there are no restrictions on who can express interest. I'll say that here we have some dates that we'd like you to keep in mind. We will be asking for expressions of interest during the period that you see here, June 10th through 24th. And we're working with Kearns and West to structure the kind of form that we'll have for how folks can submit expressions of interest. And I think it's important to also signal that we're looking to July 9th or 10th to have a first advisory group meeting. So those are dates that you can already keep in mind and consider. And we hope that you'll consider submitting an expression of interest. Sorry, I've started to go completely off script, so now I have to find my notes. Okay, so what's the scope of the advisory group, and how are we thinking about this? So Odo will be making the selection of advisory group members, and we're going to be guided by the scope of the bill. So this text, as you see here, comes from HB 3630, and we have to make sure that the advisory group has representation, has people in the room who are able to inform a discussion on all of these topics that you see here. So state energy demands and trends, energy resources, technology choices, considering costs, energy efficiency, feasibility, availability, economic and employment impacts, energy burden and affordability, energy resilience, environmental justice, land use considerations, natural resource impacts, emerging technologies and investment opportunities, energy generation, transmission, distribution infrastructure, energy efficiency, energy security, and the impacts of broader markets, community benefits, and community energy resilience. I usually don't just read a slide, but I thought it was important because I think that many people on this webinar will see themselves somewhere in here. And if you do, you might want to consider submitting an expression of interest. And I'll also add, again, from the bill, we also feel that this is just important to make sure that the advisory group represents a diverse range of interests, expertise, education, socioeconomic backgrounds, communities, geographic areas of the state. So if I turn now to the working groups are the ones who get in the weeds. So it's a forum to deep dive into key topic areas, which I'll show on the next slide. And also to understand and discuss the suggestions that have come out of the listening sessions and the organizational meetings. And so who would be in a working group? We're really looking for individuals interested in informing and able to inform topical areas of the energy strategy in more depth. And we anticipate first meetings to be scheduled mid-July and for there to be kind of an intense period, July and August, for the working groups. Some of you might remember or might have even responded to a questionnaire that we sent around in April. And the goal of that questionnaire was to help us, Jessica, should I keep going? Should I pause? Because you just popped up.
Keep going, but at the end, I'll jump in with a question.
Okay. the goal of that questionnaire was to help us think about how to organize discussions around technical issues in the energy strategy. And we got 130 responses in total. We also had other questionnaires, including for environmental justice groups. And this is a snapshot of who we heard from. Jessica, you want to ask your question now, or you want me to show you the other questionnaire slide? I can go either way.
Go ahead. When you're finished, just call in me and I'll pop back up again.
Perfect. Okay, so we also asked which topics people would be interested in engaging more deeply on. And we organized the list of topics here by how they're presented in House Bill 3630. And you can, as you can see, there was a lot of interest across these topics. And the last thing I'll say before bringing Jessica back on is that that is informing how we're thinking about how we'll organize the working groups. So when we organize the working groups, we'll likely divide up the topics a little differently. So this is not set in stone. But I'll just say the language of the bill doesn't lend itself easily to how we'd organize discussions. So what we have done is to take sometimes categories that are too broad, like energy resource and technology choices. Might be too big a topic for one group. And we've tried to think of how the topics might be divided up more effectively for a more effective conversation. So this is a starting point. We'll be working on this with our consultants. We envision 7 to 8 groups organized roughly along these lines. We'll be working on a process for how we structure the working groups and bring people into the working groups. Jessica, this is probably a good time for you to bring up the question you have.
Actually, it's a really good time. We have a question from Pat, who was interested in how many rounds of analysis, iteration, sensitivity are we planning on doing on the modeling? And in particular, they were interested in, sort of the first set of scenarios might raise questions that require first a little bit more analysis, that sort of thing. So hoping you can give us a little bit of background on that.
I almost feel like I'm kind of looking to SETI if you want to type something in here to supplement more specific, in more detail what I'll say. There will any time that you do a modeling exercise, some funky stuff comes out, and so we're going to be kind of working through that as we go. We will present what's coming out of kind of the modeling of the different scenarios in that webinar. Oh, sorry, in a webinar early next year, so which you haven't seen on the screen. So we anticipate there's kind of 2 places where kind of reflecting back and some additional feedback happens. One is the webinar when we reflect back what we heard and how that informed how we're going to propose to undertake the modeling. Then the modeling will happen. And then we understand that the results of the modeling will be much more detailed and you can't just talk about it in a webinar. And so we anticipate asking for written feedback on that. And we'll have a webinar to sort of present the information and then ask for feedback so that if there's something that raises a flag or seems like it's not right, that's the opportunity to share those thoughts and for us to take that on board and try to understand it and work through it. Jessica, if you want to add anything to that, feel free.
I do not, and I'm not seeing anyone yet from SETI having put in a response. But I do have another question that came in during that time. But is there anyone else from Odo who wanted to address that question before we move on? Great. So the next question is from Brandon, and
this is Eileen Quigley, and I can't seem to type into the chat for some reason. Would it be possible for me to answer this verbally, or do you want us to answer it some other way?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry about that. I was trying, but I can't seem to get it in. So yes, Pat is absolutely right that there's a considerable amount of iteration in this kind of modeling and additional both sensitivities. which are actually different than scenarios. And you're absolutely right that it's really important as the results are coming out that we see them and adjust along the way. So the answer to the question about how many rounds of analysis, feedback, iteration, sensitivity is difficult to say until we start to see what's coming out and how many times we have to probe. The ODO will have a set number of scenarios that they will ask us to, with stakeholder engagement, to look at, and then we will look at the results from each of those. And then if it's necessary to probe further, we'll be paying very close attention to what we see at each step along the way. The rest of what he said is also correct in terms of the timeline and how this all will unfold and how it is iterative and how we'll work with what we're learning along the way and sharing it back.
Thanks, Eileen. That's helpful.
All right, so the next question is from Brandon, and I kind of gave an answer, but I'll read the question and answer, and then please, Edith, add to it if need be. Brandon wants to know, when will the working groups and steering groups meet again? And there's so many groups that are feeding into this that it can become a little confusing. I mean, it took us a while to kind of wrap our brains around the different ways that people are inputting into the strategy. So I'll just first say that the working groups have not been formed yet. So we haven't met, we don't have people in the working groups yet. That'll be something we're actively working on with our new our new facilitating contractor that we're just getting going with. The steering group is our interagency, other partner agencies who've been helping us ensure that we're getting the existing policy and programs information right for the inputs that will go into the model. And we've been meeting with them since November just to get their feedback and input. And I believe our next meeting with them is sometime in the next week or two. I can't remember the exact date, but Edith might remember it. So
Day after
just
tomorrow.
thank you. Day after tomorrow. So those are those two groups, and really the only group that we've been actively meeting with thus far has been our steering group. Edith, anything to add to that question?
Yeah, just to say that so as Jessica I think said, we haven't yet defined how we're going to pull together the working groups. And the advisory groups we've mentioned will be soliciting expressions of interest, and we have a time frame, and we have to just work out kind of what we're going to put in the form essentially to fill out for that. The advisory groups would meet once a month throughout the whole process. So not just this year, but kind of going into next year. I think that's important to signal in case that was part of the motivation for the question. And the working groups would have kind of an intense period to help inform the modeling. And then we anticipate, we haven't worked through these details yet, but when we get to the policy discussions, often it's important to have some expertise in the room there too. So it might be that they kind of come back again when we are getting into the policy recommendations and what those might look like. In case that was the question. I didn't see it, so.
The next question that we have is from Kelly, and she's interested in, based on this list of the groups that we have in forming the strategy, do we anticipate that electric utilities might be represented in several of these working groups, as they do more than just electricity systems related to generation, transmission, distribution, but also things like energy efficiency and conservation programs or incentives for electric vehicles, heat pumps, that sort of thing?
I think that's right. I mean, it's generally different people working on these things. And so I could imagine a utility having just different staff participating in different meetings, depending on what the topic is. But the groups will not, I just feel like I need to add that the groups will not just be utilities. So we're also looking, if we talk about energy efficiency, there's Energy Trust of Oregon, there's NIA, and there are other groups that will likely have a pretty strong interest to participate in some of those discussions, including, industry representatives who can help us talk about what opportunities they see for their kind of industrial subsector. So, yeah.
Great. Our next question is from Linda, and Linda's wondering, how does this work compare with the modeling work that the Oregon Climate Action Commission did last year and continues to work on? And I'll just start and then hand it over to Edith. That the Oregon Climate Action Commission did conduct a model. Some of you may have known it as the TIGGER modeling. TIGGER is for Transformational Integrated Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction. Just say TIGGER, it's so much easier. It really looked at using our existing policies today, existing policies and programs today in Oregon. How close are we to achieving the climate goals that have been set by the state? And they found actually that we were on track to meet the 2035 goals, not on track to meet 2050 goals. And then they made a recommendation that we try to hit our 2035 goals by 2030. So that was sort of like thinking about existing state, what it looks like. And they have recommendations on ways to achieve those goals that are occurring. But where this is different is that it does look at existing policies and programs, but it also looks at how we could potentially achieve those goals. So looking into questions of, as we had questions earlier about how much distributed generation resources might we think about to get us to our goals versus building more transmission, or looking at electric vehicle adoption and heat pump adoption as ways of reducing our total energy consumption. So there's a lot of different ways that this will look at the how and sort of the what the outcomes of those different hows might mean for Oregon, whereas the TIGGER analysis was very much a look at where are we at right now. And then Edith, anything to add? And then if anybody else from ODA wants to add to that, please feel free to jump on.
I would just add that I think they're very complementary analyses. One is how far do our policies get us? And that's the kind of the OCAC. And then we're talking about how could we do it and what's missing to get there? Because these are some pretty ambitious policies that we have. So we need to do some thinking to be really thoughtful and proactive about how we meet our goals.
Great. And I have no other questions in the chat or in the Q&A, excuse me. But if you do have any more, if you do have any questions, throw them in the Q&A and I will make sure that they get over to Edith here.
Thanks, Jessica. And I'm actually almost at the end, so write your questions down. I just have a couple more slides to talk about engagement. I think it's important to emphasize that we want to make sure that everybody who wants to has an opportunity to participate in this process, whether that's joining a meeting or committing to one of the more structured groups like the working groups or the advisory group. And we will work to lower barriers to participation wherever possible. Some things that we can offer are translation and interpretation services, resources to enable participation by covering costs of travel or covering somebody's time, and considering organizing meetings outside of standard working hours. This is not an exhaustive list, and we are about to tee up a polling question to hear a little bit more about things that you think we need to consider when we're thinking about how to make sure that this is really an inclusive process. So I'm just going to put up the question here. The first one that'll come up in Slido again, so you might have to refresh your Slido button, is do you or the organization that you represent need financial support to participate in energy strategy meetings? And I might just say, I'd interpret the term financial support broadly. If there's really any support that you think would be important, I might say yes. And I'll just mention, because you can see the second question up here, even though we haven't gotten to it yet, but just to get folks thinking who have already answered this question. The next question is going to be fill in the blank, but I kept these bullets just to give a sense of like some of the kinds of things that we're thinking of. But I know that there are others, and we're just really interested to hear from you in a fill in the blank format about what resources might help enhance participation. And I'm not sure, I'm kind of looking to Jessica or Abby. I'm not sure that we're gonna see the answers that are fill in the blank up on the screen. Is that right? Because for me anyway, it kind of threw me back to the first question, or maybe we haven't teed up the second question yet.
I do not see the fill in the blank question.
Okay, it hasn't come up yet. I saw it for a moment. I think maybe it was just to foreshadow it coming.
You want me to go ahead and switch to that question? Yes.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I think we've given folks enough time. And maybe I can add while people are filling this in that we're also happy to hear from you if you want to go kind of consult with others and come back to us with ideas. We're very happy to hear those ideas too. At the end of this, oh, you can see mine. I put a period in so I could see the responses. So I'm the only one who's answered so far. We have an energy strategy email address, or you can use my email address. We're very happy to hear from you anytime. But this is also a great chance for the broader group listening into the webinar to see a little bit of the types of things that folks might think are helpful to support participation. Jessica, you popped up, so maybe there's a question relevant to this that we want to talk about.
It's not relevant to this. I want to make sure that we give people time to fill it out, but I do have a couple more questions for you whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, and maybe what I'll do, Abby, can you leave this open? I might just read out a few of the answers that we're getting now, and then Jessica, I was going to go, I think I just have one more slide, and then I'd pass it back to you for the Q&A if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So I think there's some really great ideas here, like support for mileage for people living in rural Oregon. It seems like there's a lot of virtual meetings here. Flexible meeting times. So again, I think, Abby, I think you can keep this open while I go to the next slide. So why don't we keep it open for a couple more minutes, and then folks can kind of type anything in that they're still mulling over. So this is my last slide, which is how do you get involved? There are a few ways. So I realized that we still have some details to work out that we weren't able to present today. And that's again, because we're just onboarding our consultants, onboarding Kearns and West. So there are a few things that we'd like to encourage you to do. So one is to check out our project page, which you can see here. You can also sign up for email updates on our project page, and that would just make sure whenever we send something around, like when we have the forms ready and a link for expressions of interest for the advisory group, we'll send it around an email. We'll also post something to social media. We might do some outreach just directly to make sure that we get the word out as widely as possible. But it's really helpful to us if we know that that folks are signed up for email updates and are aware of the project page, which is also where this presentation, the slides and the recording will be posted. And then you can see here the email address for the project as well. So I think the only other thing I'll say here is that the one kind of concrete entry point that we have right now is the advisory group and filling out expressions of interest. So if you think you might be interested in, just keep that date range in mind, June 10th to 24th, to prepare your, just to prepare to fill in your expression of interest. And I think it was July 9th or 10th that we would be planning to have that first meeting. We thought it would be helpful just to give everybody a heads up on when that might be so they can mark their calendars. So with that, Jessica, I'm going to hand it back to you, and maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. And if I need to bring back a slide, I can just share my screen again.
Absolutely. So Edith, the next question that I have is from Bill, and Bill's wondering how the potential for floating offshore wind to contribute to Oregon's future energy mix might be incorporating into the modeling and assumptions.
So first of all, the floating offshore wind study that we did a couple of years ago is one place that we'll look. And so that's one kind of study that we can build on. But this is, again, an area where we will be looking for stakeholder feedback, and we will need to make some assumptions in the model on cost and availability. And I think offshore wind is a good place that demonstrates that kind of risks and uncertainties piece of what we can learn by modeling different pathways. So we're not gonna, no matter what we do on offshore wind, we're not gonna say this is how much will be built, but we can test out what it means to have more or less offshore wind, for example. So I don't have a clear, definite answer because we don't know. But I think through stakeholder engagement, we'll get a sense, and also through the offshore wind study and other information and analyses that are out there, we'll be able to make an informed judgment, and that will be also informed by conversations in the listening sessions, in the organizational meetings, and the working groups, and the advisory group, of course.
Thanks, Edith. So the last question I have right now, there's still time if folks have a question to throw it into the Q&A. But the last question I have right now is a good one from Michael. And Michael asks, since House Bill 2021 requires our electricity to be 100% clean by 2040, but it also has off-ramps for the utilities if costs meet the goal that was set, which I think is 6%. He indicated in here that it is. Although utilities have not yet met any incurred costs working towards that goal. But Portland General Electric is already seeking a 7%, an additional, they had an increase just earlier this year, another 7% increase. Will Odo's energy strategy address this hurdle, which he thinks is unrealistic to achieving Oregon's important clean energy goals?
So the short answer is that we're very aware of this, and we will need to figure out how we address this in the strategy. But I can't say more than that right now because we haven't gotten there. We've just started to work with our consultants, and so there's a lot that we haven't worked through yet. But it's a really important point, and it's one that we're very aware of. And if anybody from Odo wants to jump in and add to that, please do.
I'll just add to that costs to the consumer are an important piece of what the energy strategy will do. And one of the things that SETI will be producing and through our work with them is an energy wallet, sort of looking at what different changes in the scenarios might mean for Oregonians as far as what they're paying for energy costs. That's across not just electricity, but transportation fuels, heating fuels, et cetera. So information will be coming, and that's part of this initial modeling phase, is to try and wrap our brains around what the implications of different policy choices might look like.
Yeah, thanks. There's also something that I haven't mentioned, but I see Morgan Schaefer from DEQ here, and I realized that I didn't make the link when I was leading into the energy strategy with the comprehensive climate action plan that Oregon is developing under the climate pollution reduction grant from the US EPA. So I feel like it's just worth for those who are paying attention to the these connections, that the Oregon energy strategy is an important part of the comprehensive climate action plan. And so we're also working with the Department of Environmental Quality on that. Now that I don't have my slides up, I'm scrolling through questions, but I think we've
hit them.
answered. Okay.
We do have 8 more minutes if anybody has a question that they would like to ask. And I'm going to put the link to our webpage as a response to the last question, which came from Michael, only because I can't actually add my own question into the Q&A. So that way, if anybody wants to just quickly link on it, and that will send them over to the webpage. And you can sign up for email updates and track the work that we're doing from that webpage.
Thanks, Jessica. And I mean, I'll just thank everyone who was willing to join. This was I know going over an hour for a webinar is sometimes tricky, and it's difficult for people to dedicate so much time to one event. So I really appreciate you all being willing to listen to us, and really hope that you'll pay attention to the emails and the website and consider getting involved. We want to hear from you. Thanks.
Edith, we've gotten some thank yous, and we appreciate people's time. And I have failed to put the website link up, but I'm gonna try to do it again and see if it works.
Thanks, Jessica. We won't shut down until that link is up there. And again, the presentation and the recording will be on the website too, for anybody who wants to have access to those links. And somebody just had a suggestion, so I'm happy to do that too. I'm just going to share my screen for one more second. There's still some people on, and I just feel like I can bring up the last slide, which has, oops, a QR code that folks can scan from their computers. So here you go. Oops. There's the QR code in case anybody wants to scan it. I hope you can all see this. Can you see it, Jessica?
I can.
Okay.
And you can, if you have a camera QR reader on your phone, go ahead and just scan it from right there. It works great. And I did through the link in to the Q&A. It doesn't actually show up as a link, but if you copy it and paste it in, it'll work then.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and hope everyone has a great week.